I need to share something scary that happened to me, Pedro, and Ana last month. The three of us are addicted to retro games and are always on the lookout for rare titles for our collection. It all started when we found an ad on Facebook Marketplace about an incredible collection of PS1 games being sold at an unreal price. The seller, who identified himself as Ricardo, lived in an old mansion in the Morumbi neighborhood of São Paulo. It was one of those huge houses from the 60s that gives you chills just by looking at it. We scheduled to meet on a Wednesday night around 8 p.m., as that was the only time he could receive us. We arrived by Uber because none of us had a car. The house was at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by a tall wall covered in ivy. The iron gate made an eerie sound when we opened it. The garden was completely abandoned, with ancient statues covered in moss and a broken fountain in the center. Pedro, who has always been the most excited one in the group, went ahead. Ana, who is sensitive and has always had a strong connection to the supernatural, started to feel uneasy as soon as we stepped onto the property. "Something is wrong here," she whispered, but Pedro and I were so caught up in the excitement about the games that we didn't pay much attention. Ricardo greeted us at the door. He was a tall, very pale man with deep-set eyes and a strange smile. He wore clothes that looked like they were from another era. He led us inside the house, and the smell of mold and something rotten was almost unbearable. The mansion was practically empty, except for a few old pieces of furniture covered with white sheets. "The games are in the basement," he said, pointing to a door under the main staircase. Ana squeezed my arm tightly when Ricardo opened the door. A wooden staircase descended into total darkness. He turned on a single dim light that swung from the basement ceiling, creating dancing shadows on the walls. We descended slowly, the steps creaking beneath our feet. The basement was huge, filled with shelves full of games, but there was something strange in the air. The temperature dropped drastically, and our breath formed small clouds in the air. Ricardo stood at the top of the stairs, watching us with that unsettling smile. That's when we started to hear the voices. At first, they were just distant whispers, but then they became clearer. Ana began to tremble and said she could see people in the shadows, dozens of them, watching us. Pedro, who was examining the games, let out a muffled scream when a cold hand touched his shoulder. When we turned around, we saw an elderly woman wearing an old dress. Her figure was partially transparent, and her feet did not touch the ground. Ana started to cry silently, saying she could feel the pain and suffering of all the souls trapped in that place. The shelves began to shake, and games fell to the ground without anyone touching them. More spirits started to materialize. A group of children in clothes from the last century, a man in a blood-stained suit, a young woman with marks on her neck. They all stared at us with empty eyes and expressions of deep sadness. We ran to the stairs, but the basement door had closed. Ricardo had vanished. We began banging on the door desperately as the spirits drew closer. The air grew denser and colder with each passing second, and a strong smell of decomposition filled the room. Ana, even terrified, began to communicate with the spirits. Through her, we discovered the terrible history of that mansion. In the early 20th century, it was an illegal psychiatric clinic where cruel experiments were conducted. The souls we saw were those of patients who died there, trapped and tortured. Pedro tried to use his cell phone to call for help, but no devices worked in the basement. The lights began to flicker more intensely, and between the flashes, we could see the spirits getting closer. One of the ghost children approached Ana and held her hand. The spot where she was touched turned instantly purple. The man in the blood-stained suit began to tell his story through Ana. He was a doctor who tried to report the abuses of the clinic and was murdered for it. He said that Ricardo was not a real person, but rather the spirit of the former director of the clinic, who lured people to the basement to feed some kind of macabre ritual. The walls began to ooze a dark, viscous liquid, and sounds of screams and cries echoed throughout the space. The temperature continued to drop, and our bodies trembled uncontrollably. Pedro, who had always been the most skeptical in the group, was in shock, murmuring prayers his grandmother had taught him. Ana, using her spiritual sensitivity, began to guide a deeper communication with the spirits. The elderly woman in the old dress approached and, through Ana, explained that there was a way to escape, but we needed to help them first. She revealed that beneath the basement floor lay the remains of several victims who had never been found, and their souls could not rest until their remains were properly buried. Pedro, still trembling, found a spot on the floor that sounded hollow when we stepped on it. Using a rusty crowbar we found among the shelves, we began to lift the floorboards. What we found underneath was horrifying. Dozens of human skeletons, some still with pieces of deteriorated clothing. The spirits became increasingly agitated as we revealed their remains. The air grew so thick that we could barely breathe. The ghost child who had touched Anna began to sing a disturbing lullaby, and all the other spirits joined in a supernatural chorus that made the walls vibrate. Suddenly, we heard heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. It was Ricardo, but his appearance had changed completely. Now he looked like a deformed being, with grey skin and completely black eyes. He carried an ancient book and began to recite words in an unknown language. Anna shouted that we needed to stop him from completing the ritual. According to her, he was trying to use our life energy to keep the souls trapped there forever. In a desperate act of courage, Pedro ran and snatched the book from Ricardo's hands. The moment the book hit the ground, an intense light emerged from the exposed bones. The spirits began to move toward Ricardo, who for the first time showed fear. The elderly woman in the old dress led the group, her figure now emanating a bluish light. Ricardo tried to escape, but the souls surrounded him. His body began to dissolve like smoke as he screamed in a voice that did not sound human. The temperature started to rise gradually, and the walls stopped oozing that dark liquid. Anna fell to her knees, exhausted from the intense connection with the spiritual world. The spirits of the children began to disappear one by one, their faces now showing peace instead of sadness. The elderly woman in the dress approached Anna one last time and, through her, thanked us for freeing the trapped souls. She explained that they could finally rest in peace, but warned us that some places hold such dense energies that they continue to attract supernatural manifestations even after the spirits are freed. When the last spirit disappeared, the basement door opened on its own. We ran up the stairs, still in shock from everything that had happened. The mansion looked different. It seemed older, more deteriorated, as if we had lived in two different temporal dimensions during our stay in the basement. We stepped out into the garden and noticed that several hours had passed. It was almost dawn. Our cell phones started working again, showing dozens of missed calls from our worried families. Pedro had deep scratches on his back, resembling claw marks. Anna had a high fever and that purple mark on her hand where the ghost child had touched her. In the following days, we began researching the history of the mansion. We discovered in old newspapers that there really was a clandestine psychiatric clinic there in the 1920s. The director, Dr. Ricardo Mendez, had mysteriously disappeared after reports of mistreatment of patients. The photos in the historical archives showed exactly the same man who had received us. Anna continued to have visions and nightmares with the children from the basement. She said they were still trying to communicate, as if they wanted to warn us about something. Pedro developed a terrible fear of enclosed spaces and started sleeping with the lights on. I began to notice shadows in the corners of my house and heard that lullaby at random moments. A week later, we returned to the mansion during the day, accompanied by the police and a group of archaeologists. The bones were found exactly where we had seen them, and an investigation was opened. More than 50 bodies were identified, including children and adults, all showing signs of violent death. The most disturbing discovery was finding, among the remains, a skeleton wearing a suit with a medical badge, the remains of the real Dr. Ricardo Mendez. Next to the body was the same ancient book that Pedro had torn from his spectral hands, but now completely deteriorated and illegible. Today, 6 months after the incident, we still deal with the consequences of that night. The mansion was demolished after the remains were removed, and a memorial was built on the site in honor of the victims. Anna became a respected medium, helping others facing supernatural issues. Pedro decided to study parapsychology to better understand what we experienced. The games we saw in the basement were never found. It was as if they had disappeared along with the spirits. Curiously, each of us received a single unlabeled PlayStation tape at home. When we tried to play it, the screen showed only static and that lullaby the children sang in the basement. The physical marks remained. The purple mark on Anna's hand never completely disappeared, and the scratches on Pedro's back turned into scars that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. I developed a special sensitivity. I can feel when there are supernatural presences nearby. Recently, we discovered that other people had also been drawn to the mansion over the years, always with the promise of finding something valuable. Some disappeared, others went mad. We found a Facebook group of survivors sharing experiences similar to ours. The case gained media attention and interest from paranormal researchers. Documentaries were made, books were written, but none truly captured the terror we experienced that night. Police investigations continue, revealing more and more dark details about the history of the clinic and its patients. Anna says that she sometimes still receives visits from the children in her dreams, but now they seem at peace, playing in a sunny garden. Pedro kept the deteriorated book in a blessed glass box, which he keeps in his office as a reminder of our experience. As for me, I could never play video games again without thinking about that night. The lesson we learned is that there are boundaries between worlds that should not be crossed. Sometimes a simple search for old games can lead us to discover terrible truths about the past and the nature of reality. Today, we are more cautious with our searches for rarities, always researching the history of the places and people involved. The mansion may have been demolished, but its story and the souls that suffered there will never be forgotten. And the three of us, united by that supernatural experience, continued to seek answers to the questions that night left us with, knowing that some of them may never be answered.